Cruise lines spend millions making their ships look accessible, welcoming, and senior-friendly. What they don't spend is much time telling senior passengers what they are actually entitled to ask for, request, or demand. Some of these rights are written into maritime law. Some are buried in accessibility policies. All of them are real, and almost none of them get volunteered unless you know to ask first. Right number 1. Priority boarding and seated check-in. No wheelchair required. This is the one that surprises people most, because the assumption is that priority boarding is reserved for suite guests, loyalty tier members, and passengers in wheelchairs. That assumption is wrong, and it costs seniors unnecessary discomfort on one of the most physically demanding parts of any cruise. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, cruise lines operating from U.S. ports are required to provide reasonable accommodations for passengers who need them. That obligation extends to the embarkation process. If standing in a terminal queue is difficult, whether due to joint pain, fatigue, circulation issues, or any other age-related condition, you're entitled to request assistance. You don't need a formal disability designation. You don't need a wheelchair. You just need to ask. That framing matters more than people realize. The word accessibility triggers a different internal process at most cruise lines than a general service request does. Using it, even in a phone call that takes 5 minutes, routes your request to the people who actually have authority to act on it. Contact the cruise line's accessibility desk before sailing and note that you require embarkation assistance. Most major lines, Carnival, Royal Caribbean, Norwegian, MSC, Celebrity, have dedicated accessibility contact points for this purpose. When you arrive at the terminal, identify yourself to port staff and reference your pre-arranged request. From that point, you should be directed to a seated check-in area, a shorter processing lane, or a priority boarding sequence that bypasses the general queue. Cruise line accessibility policies are written around need, not diagnosis. Discomfort in long queues is a need. Difficulty on extended gangway walks is a need. You don't need a medical certification. You need a phone call made before you arrive at the port. Right number 2. Cabin location adjustments after booking. The cabin you booked is not necessarily the cabin you have to stay in, and the sold out message on the booking portal is not the final word on what's available. Cruise lines maintain accessible and proximity cabins held back from general inventory specifically for passengers with mobility needs. These include cabins close to elevator banks, cabins on lower decks that reduce walking distance to main venues, and fully accessible cabins with wider doorways, roll-in showers, and grab bars. These don't always appear in the standard booking flow. They're managed separately through the accessibility department. If your booked cabin creates daily challenges, contact the accessibility desk directly and describe the specific issue. This works best when the request is made early rather than after final payment. Passengers who make the call often find inventory that the booking website never showed them. Now, the timing of this request matters more than most passengers realize. Accessible inventory gets allocated on a first-come basis once the accessibility desk begins processing requests for a given sailing. Passengers who call early consistently have more options available than those who wait until 2 weeks before departure and find the best positions already assigned. Now, it's also worth asking specifically about midship cabins on lower decks. Midship positioning reduces the sensation of movement in rough seas, which affects sleep quality significantly for older passengers more sensitive to motion. Now, that detail rarely appears in cabin descriptions, but experienced cruise staff know it immediately when you ask. Describe the specific daily challenge rather than making a general upgrade request. I have difficulty walking long distances and my current cabin is far from the nearest elevator. Now, that's a concrete accessibility need that goes somewhere. Can I get a better cabin is a different conversation entirely. Right number 3. Tender priority at ports. Not every cruise port has a dock that accommodates a large ship directly. At tender ports, where passengers transfer to shore via small boats, the process involves steps, movement on water, and a physical transfer that can be genuinely challenging for passengers with mobility limitations. Most major cruise lines have a formal tender priority policy for passengers with mobility needs, applying regardless of loyalty status or cabin category. The process typically involves registering with guest services the day before the tender port, identifying that you require assistance, and being directed to an assisted boarding lane that manages the transfer more carefully than the general passenger flow. The ship won't announce this policy over the PA or include it in the daily program. It exists in the accessibility section of the cruise line's policies and is activated by the passenger asking, not by the crew volunteering it. For passengers using mobility devices, crew members are required to assist with physical transfer between the gangway and the tender boat. That assistance carries no additional fee. Now, if crew members are not proactively offering assistance to passengers who visibly need it, requesting it directly is both appropriate and supported by the line's own policy. Now, if tender conditions are unsafe, rough waters, or significant swell, the ship's officers can cancel tender operations entirely. Seniors who registered accessibility needs in advance are typically the first to be notified and the first to receive alternative arrangements or port credit. That notification only happens if your name is already on the list. Right number 4. Onboard medical assistance and what it actually covers. Every cruise ship operating internationally is required under maritime law to carry medical personnel and maintain a facility capable of providing emergency and primary care. Standards are governed by the American College of Emergency Physicians for cruise ship medicine, which sets minimum requirements for staffing and equipment. There's a doctor and nursing staff on board, and they're there to treat passengers. Medical consultations on board are not free as a general rule. They're billed to your onboard account and can be significant. However, if a medical issue arises as a direct result of a ship condition, a fall on a wet deck, an illness linked to a documented onboard breakout, or an injury in a cruise-operated venue, the question of whether charges apply is worth raising directly with medical staff and guest services. For seniors with pre-existing conditions, notify the cruise line in writing through the accessibility or special needs desk before sailing. This creates a documented record, ensures the medical team has relevant history before an emergency, and in some cases affects what the ship's medical staff can provide in terms of ongoing support. Also, verify before sailing whether the ship's medical facility stocks your regular prescription medications. Not every ship carries every drug. Knowing whether your medication needs to be entirely self-supplied in sufficient quantity for the voyage plus a contingency buffer is a conversation worth having before the gangway, not after. Bringing a written medication list, including generic names, dosages, and prescribing physician contact details, is a practice the ship's medical team genuinely appreciates, and that significantly speeds up any medical interaction on board. It also ensures accuracy in the event that a medical situation arises when you are not in a position to communicate that information yourself. Right number 5. Mobility device assistance at no extra charge. If you travel with a walker, cane, manual wheelchair, or scooter, the cruise line is required to assist you at embarkation, disembarkation, and tender ports. That assistance is not a premium service, does not appear on a fee schedule, and is part of the baseline accessibility obligation cruise lines carry under the ADA Maritime Guidelines. Now, mobility scooters require advance notification, typically at least 48 hours before sailing, and in many cases at booking. Ships have specific storage and charging locations for scooters, and cabin suitability varies significantly. An accessible cabin is designed around scooter use. A standard cabin often is not. If you did not disclose scooter use at booking, the ship is not obligated to provide a cabin swap on embarkation day. The obligation runs from the point of disclosure forward. For passengers who don't own a scooter but would benefit from one, most major cruise lines have partnerships with rental companies, typically Special Needs at Sea or Scoot Around, that deliver directly to the ship. That option is rarely mentioned in booking communications or onboard orientation materials. The rental cost for a 7-night sailing is often lower than passengers assume, and the difference it makes to daily mobility on a large ship, where the distance between the cabin and main venues can exceed a quarter mile each way, is significant enough that many first-time renters describe it as the best decision they made for the voyage. Right number 6. Dining accommodations beyond the standard schedule. The dining schedule is presented as fixed because managing thousands of meals requires structure. What it doesn't require is that every passenger fit that structure regardless of their needs. Seniors with specific dietary requirements, low sodium, diabetic appropriate meals, texture modified foods, or allergen restrictions are entitled to request customized meal preparation from the main dining room kitchen. This is a standard accessibility accommodation available on every major line without additional charge. Contact the Special Dietary Needs Desk at least 2 weeks before sailing. Confirm the request with the maitre d' on the first evening. Those 2 steps create a documented record that follows the passenger through every main dining room service for the entire voyage. Now, the right also extends to seating. Passengers who require quieter areas, tables positioned for walker or wheelchair access, or seating near the entrance can request these through the same channel. Early dining times, which tend to be less crowded, are often available on accessibility grounds even when the booking portal shows them as full. One accommodation most seniors never think to request? A consistent table assignment with the same serving team for the entire voyage. On ships with flexible dining systems, seating can be rotated or reassigned. Requesting a fixed assignment through the maitre d' on the first evening creates continuity that makes communicating dietary needs significantly easier across every subsequent meal, without re-explaining preferences to a different server every night. If your dietary needs are complex, like multiple simultaneous restrictions or requirements that involve modifying standard preparation methods, asking to speak directly with the head chef or dining manager on the first evening is entirely appropriate. Right number 7. Shore excursion accommodations and the refund question. Shore excursions sold through the cruise line carry an implicit representation that they are appropriate for the general passenger population. When an excursion involves physical requirements not clearly disclosed at the point of sale, and a senior passenger finds on the day that it is not suitable for them, the question of a refund or credit is legitimate, not just a customer service appeal. If an excursion was described as easy or suitable for all fitness levels, and the physical reality doesn't match that description, the discrepancy is a documented basis for a refund request. The practical approach is to raise the issue with the shore excursion desk before departing the ship, not after returning. A passenger who raises the concern before departure gives the cruise line the opportunity to offer an alternative or process a cancellation. A passenger who completes the excursion and then complains has a significantly weaker position. Most cruise lines have a low-impact or accessible excursion category not prominently featured in the main catalog. Asking the shore excursion desk specifically for accessible options surfaces inventory that the catalog design tends to bury. Also, ask specifically about transportation. Some excursions listed as low impact still involve standard coach seating without accessible modifications. Others use vehicles with step-free boarding. That distinction matters enormously for passengers with hip, knee, or lower back limitations, and the excursion staff can answer it directly if you ask before you commit. And it's also worth asking whether the excursion includes any waiting periods involving prolonged standing. Right number 8. Medical cancellation protections and onboard credit. This right operates across 2 separate channels, and most passengers only know about one of them. The first is travel insurance. Comprehensive cruise travel insurance with a cancellation for medical reasons provision covers trip cancellation, interruption, and in some policies, medical evacuation. Many seniors purchase minimum coverage or the cruise line's own protection plan without reading what it actually covers. The cruise line's own plan is typically the least comprehensive option available. The second channel is the cruise line's own internal policy on medical situations arising during the voyage. If a passenger experiences a medical emergency that results in unscheduled disembarkation, missed ports, or curtailed participation in paid services, The guest relations policy typically includes provisions for partial credits, future voyage credits, or fee waivers. Now, these are not advertised, they are requested. The documentation required is straightforward: the onboard medical record, a written account of the dates and services affected, and a formal written request submitted to guest relations within the time frame specified in the passenger ticket contract, typically 30 to 60 days after the voyage ends. Now, verbal requests at the guest services desk during the cruise rarely produce the same outcome as written post-voyage submissions. The passenger ticket contract contains the specific time frames and submission requirements for these claims. Reading the relevant sections before you sail means you know exactly what documentation to gather and how long you have to submit it. That preparation takes 20 minutes and costs nothing. Now, it's also worth noting that comprehensive third-party travel insurance, purchased independently rather than through the cruise line, typically includes a pre-existing condition waiver if the policy is purchased within a specified window of the initial trip deposit, usually 14 to 21 days. Seniors with ongoing health conditions who miss that window often assume coverage is unavailable, but in many cases it's still available under different terms and worth investigating before dismissing the option entirely. Right number 9. Terminal assistance that nobody announces. U.S. port terminals are subject to ADA requirements mandating accessible facilities and assistance services. Internationally, major terminals in the UK, EU, and Australia operate under equivalent frameworks. What none of them do is announce those services proactively. The assistance available typically includes wheelchair or mobility aid loan from arrival through to the gangway, dedicated assistance lanes at check-in and security screenings, staff escorts for passengers who need directional or physical support, and priority processing at the boarding checkpoint. At disembarkation, the equivalent services apply in reverse, including assistance through customs, immigration, and to ground transportation. The activation mechanism is always the same. Ask. At the terminal entrance, identify yourself to any staff member and state that you require accessibility assistance. In more formalized terminals, a dedicated assistance desk handles requests and assigns a staff member. The service is free. The staff are trained for it. The only barrier is that passengers don't know to ask because the terminal doesn't tell them. For U.S. departures, pre-arranging terminal assistance through the cruise line before arrival produces a more seamless experience than requesting it on that day. The cruise line communicates the request to the port agent, who has a staff member ready on arrival rather than responding reactively in a busy terminal. For international departures, the quality of terminal assistance varies significantly by port. A major terminal in Southampton or Barcelona has a well-resourced accessibility operation. Smaller regional ports may have more limited staffing. A 5-minute call before travel day tells you what to expect at your specific departure point. Now, it's also worth asking the cruise line's accessibility desk whether the port uses a third-party terminal operator or the cruise line's own staff for accessibility assistance. The answer affects who to contact if something isn't working on that day. At ports using third-party operators, the cruise line's port agent is the correct escalation point. Knowing that distinction in advance means you're not navigating it under pressure in a busy terminal. Right number 10. Senior discounts and the perks that only appear when you ask. The cruise industry's approach to senior pricing is inconsistent, poorly publicized, and almost entirely dependent on the passenger initiating the conversation. A significant number of eligible passengers pay full price for sailings they could have booked at a discount. Most major cruise lines offer age-based pricing reductions for passengers 55 and older, though the threshold and structure varies by line and sailing. These discounts are not always visible on the public booking portal. They appear when you call and ask specifically whether a senior rate applies, or when you book through a travel agent who knows to ask on your behalf. Carnival, Holland America, and MSC have historically offered documented senior rate programs. Others apply age-based pricing selectively on sailings where inventory needs to be moved. The benefit seniors miss most frequently is the accessible cabin upgrade. When an accessible cabin goes unsold close to the sailing date, cruise lines will often upgrade a senior passenger who has registered an accessibility need at no additional cost. The upgrade is not offered. It's given when the need is on file and the cabin is available. Registration with the accessibility desk before sailing is what puts you in position to receive it. The broader principle connecting all 10 of these rights is the same one. Cruise lines are businesses, and their default is to provide the standard experience to passengers who don't signal they need something different. Seniors who communicate their needs clearly in advance through the right channels consistently receive a materially better experience than those who board hoping the ship will figure it out. The ship won't, but you can. That principle applies from the first phone call to the last morning on board. The passengers who get the most from a cruise are not always the ones who paid the most or sailed the most. They're the ones who treated the booking process as the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of it, and kept asking the right questions all the way through. Now, none of these rights require a fight. They require a phone call, a written request, or a direct question at the right desk. Cruise lines build their policies around passengers who ask and their revenue around passengers who don't. And now you know which category to be in. Hit like, subscribe, and watch the next video. There's more where this came from. Your voyage is just beginning.